on Holocaust and the... Okay, great. I'll welcome you again, just so we have that on video. Welcome everyone to this panel on Holocaust and the digital on our last day of this conference. We have three very exciting speakers with us here today, and we're going to start with someone all the way from Australia who is here to join us from an entirely different time zone. We have Tamika Glouftsis joining us online. Welcome, Tamika. She is a PhD student at the University of Adelaide in Australia, and she's also a historical game designer and community lead at the game Dream of Darkness, which is an Aztec cosmic horror 3D adventure. I found that on your Twitter account. She also makes critical videos about history on her channel, The Pixel Critic, which I urge you all to check out. Today, Tamika will speak about history, trauma, and complicity, the Holocaust in digital interactive media. If you'd like to share a presentation, you can share your screen over Zoom, and we're ready to listen to you.
Mute myself. Okay, am I coming through okay? Okay. How's the share screen? Is that working fine?
It is.
Are we good? Okay, we're in. Fantastic. Thank you for such a kind introduction. Thank you for plugging some of my personal projects as well. That's very kind of you. So my topic today is history, trauma, and complicity, the Holocaust in digital interactive media. I'm going to start with a quote from one of our panelists for this conference, Wolf Kansteiner, whose work has been really inspiring to me in this field. And Wolf has written that Holocaust memory has simply not yet arrived in the digital age. I just realized that this is blocking some of my PowerPoint. Let me move that out of the way. Okay, that should be better. Anyway, Holocaust memory has not yet arrived in the digital age, especially if we're talking about simulative, immersive narrative experiences, the kinds that we see in video games. This is the issue that I'll be addressing today. So here's how I'm going to be addressing it. My question that I'll be asking is, how might Holocaust memory embrace the digital age through video games? I'm going to be looking at two case studies of games that explore complicity. So the first is Train by Brenda Romero. It's a Holocaust-themed board game meets art installation. And the second is Papers, Please, a digital game released in 2013, which is not Holocaust-themed, but it's highly instructive on techniques to depict complicity in digital media. And what I'll be arguing is that these games engage the player in processes that interactively explore agency, resistance, and webs of complicity during a traumatic historical period. So firstly, I'll just start off by briefly introducing the concept of complicity. One of the largest and most troubling questions that looms over Holocaust studies is how seemingly ordinary humans could have been complicit in these events. So things like the Milgram obedience experiment and the countless articles and documentaries about how ordinary people become murderers show that public memory culture is always grappling with the question of how good people could have done such horrific things or been complicit in their perpetration. And as we can see in the trials of ex-concentration camp guards or SS bureaucrats, we are constantly renegotiating the limits of culpability. How good were people like, say, Oscar Groening, the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, who was a cog in the machine of Auschwitz? And more terrifyingly, could we perhaps have ended up as similar cogs in similar machines, given similar circumstances? So we as historians can think of sophisticated answers to these questions based on our research, but it's not easy to communicate the results of this research to a general audience in an accessible way that's also suitably sophisticated and nuanced. So in this presentation, I want to make a case for video games as an ideal medium for public engagement with these difficult concepts. So the history of complicity in fiction is already well established in films and in other digital media. Films such as Mephisto, The Grey Zone, The Sorrow and the Pity, and books by authors such as Hannah Arendt and Primo Levi all cover these topics of perpetration, complicity, bystanders, and resistance. I'm not sure why there's blue lines on this screen. Can you guys see that? I think the annotate thing has done something. Let me There we go. Fabulous. Okay, sorry about that. Now, video games have already been established as a mature medium capable of sophisticated narrative engagement with difficult topics. But where do they come into the equation in regards to historical engagement? Well, these case studies will hopefully make a case for the interactive and choice-based nature of games, allowing us to deeply engage with issues of complicity and choice, understanding them from the inside out. And the first case study I'll look at is Train, a board game created in 2009 as an art installation. Exists. It can't be bought at a shop or played. It's been showcased by the creator Brenda Romero at various exhibitions, museums, conferences, etc. What this game does is manipulate social conventions around gameplay in order to interrogate issues of complicity and conformity to social rules. So how does the game do this? Well, first I'll just cover a bit about how the game works. The basic idea of the game is to load as many people onto the little box cars as possible. So you can see, I'll just go back, you've got the picture of the box cars there, and you can see the little figurines represent people. As the turns of the game progress, the trains move and typewritten cards will announce various obstacles that might prevent the train from reaching its destination. The cards can also contain speed boosts and things like that, or ways to sabotage other players' trains. And the twist of the game, which makes it relevant to the Holocaust, is that when the boxcar reaches the destination, a card is flipped over and it's revealed that the train has arrived at a concentration camp. So the trains were trains full of Jews and the destination was a camp. Now, this sounds extremely gimmicky when I describe it like that. That's how I felt when I was first researching the game. I thought this is a cheap twist, a cheap attempt to sort of shock people. And never mind the problematic implication that nobody had any idea where the trains were going or no idea what was happening. However, the more that I read about this game and read about how it was played, people's reactions to it and their reflections on it, I realized that the game is actually manipulating social conventions around gameplay to interrogate these issues of complicity and conformity to systems that structure our behavior. So how does the game do this? Well, the rules of the game are deliberately very ambiguous. So players tend to follow unwritten rules about how to play a game in lieu of very specific instructions. They default to their habits and their unconscious rules that structure behavior. So they don't ask too many questions. They don't challenge the status quo. And they ultimately become complicit in the playing out of a simulated genocide. So they tend not to skip to the end. They don't ask where the train is going. They don't interfere with other players' belongings directly. They don't grab other players' trains or people. They don't break the rules of the game that are unspoken. It even takes advantage of the way that people don't want to spoil the ending for others. So most players don't reveal the twist to others, even after they've discovered it for themselves. And so in this way, the game creates a sort of system that structures people's behavior in a way that makes them complicit. The theme of resistance also emerges in the way players reacted after the twist. So players tended to privately work against the other players on their own to try and prevent humans from being taken to the concentration camp. But fascinatingly, they still tended to perform these actions within the boundaries of the system following. They might have hid the yellow pegs under the board. Maybe they declared the figures escaped to Denmark in a sort of counter narrative that they made up. Sometimes they will try to derail the trains of other players and start playing the game in a more sabotage-based way. But very rarely did they actually reveal the twist to the other player or do anything to halt the game's progress. They still didn't interfere with the other players' pieces and things like that. And another key point of interest here is the ambiguous ending. So one of the instructions given in the game is train is over when it ends. So it is up to the players themselves to decide when to walk away. When do they stop being complicit? Do they even have that choice? And as you can see in my last point, one player continued to play by himself long after the others had left the game. He was determined to free every single figure. And he told Romero, the designer who was there, I can't walk away. So train in this way acts as a microcosm, as a mirror to real life complicity under destructive and oppressive systems, where people are more likely to go along with these silent, unwritten rules structuring behavior than to radically go against the status quo and resist being complicit in atrocity. Of course, it is limited as a microcosm. It is more of a little social experiment that's meant to reflect on one aspect of complicity. Naturally, the game can't capture the full complex experience of living under the Nazi regime. But I think this quote here from Brenda really illustrates well what she has achieved with this game. She says, "I was trying to figure out a way to show people how you can in a destructive system. That's all a game is, it's a system of rules. But when humans do something unspeakable to other humans, there is a system there too. All human on human tragedy has a system." And we can definitely see parallels here with a lot of the scholarship on the Nazi atrocities and the way that behavior was structured within the system. So in that way, the game causes players to reflect on how they conform to the game system and how they might be complicit in similar systems and rules. I'm going to move on to my next case study now, which is Papers, Please. This is a digital game. It's available on Steam. It was released in 2013 to a lot of acclaim and a lot of praise. It's won a lot of awards and it's sold quite well. It's set in a fictional Cold War inspired country called Arstotzka. So it's not set in the Holocaust. It's not set in a literal, real historical period, but it is obviously very strongly based on the Cold War era, set behind the Iron Curtain in 1982. So the player is a border immigration officer tasked with inspecting passports and immigration papers and deciding whether to let people across the border. And what this game does, I argue, it combats agency inflation of historical problem that simulates a complex web of affordances and limitations. How does the game do this? I'll talk a little bit about how the game works. So what Papers, Please does is forces players to make some very difficult decisions, and the constraints placed on the player's decision making and the opportunities and affordances that they have illustrate the difficulty of making ethical choices while living under an oppressive regime and how easy it is to become complicit in this sort of oppression. So let's look at some of these affordances and constraints. There are many situations in the game where a stranger who has arrived at the border will be begging you for help. Maybe they're saying, "I'll be killed if I return to my country." But firstly, how do you know that they're telling the truth? They could be a terrorist or a criminal, and this sort of thing does happen in the game. Sometimes a terrorist will attack and kill people if you make the mistake of letting them in when they are, obviously bad people. In the corner screenshot here, you can see that one person comes to you and says, "There's a man in the line who I'm scared he's going to partake in human trafficking. I'm afraid of him. Please do something." And within your role as a border guard, what can you do? If that man has all the correct papers, how can you not let him in? What are your options? What are your affordances here? So these are the sorts of situations that the game puts you in. If you decide to believe and help a certain person who doesn't have the right papers, are you willing to shoulder the potential consequences of breaking the rules for that person? So you can come under arrest for violating direct orders, for example. This is a screenshot of what happens at the end of each day in the game. So money and salary and your family's condition is a big factor that exerts pressure on your decision making in this game. So you're paid according to how well you perform your job, how well you follow the rules. So if too many mistakes are made, like letting people through when you shouldn't, the player can lose their job, their apartment, or even be imprisoned, as we saw in the last slide. Family with no way to support themselves. So you constantly have to balance and weigh up the opportunities to help others and resist with the potential consequences that can be suffered by your own family and loved ones. You can see in the side of the screenshot as well that there's a hungry and sick status for your family. So you have to manage that too. There's all of these different constraints and factors to take into consideration. So the game is constantly placing the player in these difficult moral situations and confronting them with the consequences of their choices. Very rarely is one of these moral choices straightforward or uncomplicated in the game. And we can use the concept of the historical problem space to sort of map out and illustrate how the game really elegantly and effectively helps us understand the complex contexts in which historical decisions were made by past actors. So this is an idea taken from Jeremiah McCall, who's a game studies scholar, and and he's invented this concept, the historical problem space. But this is a very simplified and pared back version. So I'm not using the full framework of the problem space, but just taking this idea of mapping out all of these sort of elements in the mental space or the physical space of a historical actor and putting that into a game. So you can see here I've listed some of the affordances and some of the constraints. And this is just a small number of them, a very small number. And as you can see here, each of these individual points can be broken down into many, many sub-points with its own affordances, constraints, pressures, and opportunities. So aiding the resistance movement ESIC, they have, there's all of these implications and consequences and opportunities that can stem from that as well. So one of the things that is really remarkable about Papers, Please is that it also illustrates the sort of banality of resistance as well. Resistance, especially in World War II era, tends to be portrayed in media as very masculinized, very militarized, very glorious. It's usually quite violent. We think about partisans or sabotage and that sort of thing. But realistically, the choices available to most people were not quite that exciting. There was a lot more mundanity in the choices of resistance available to most everyday people. So what this game does is represents a realistic problem space of choices that would have been available to a menial clerk, a bureaucrat perhaps, living through an oppressive authoritarian period. So each choice available to the player is an opportunity to resist or an opportunity to be complicit in a totalitarian system. But as we've seen, these choices are not at all simple or clear cut, and there are potentially terrible consequences at almost every turn. What this problem space does by placing the player into the simulation is countering the agency inflation that often happens when people consider the choices made in the past. What this means is that when we look back at someone, say, living under the Nazi regime, and maybe they didn't do anything to prevent deportations or whatnot, there's a belief that ordinary people had a plurality of choices. We tend to overestimate how many choices these people had, how many were realistically available to them, or perhaps if we know now with hindsight that they had these choices, we overestimate how visible they were to the actors at the time. So due to these available choices, we often tend to estimate that the choice not to actively resist was therefore essentially a choice to collaborate. However, a lot of research in this space has found that state violence was such an integral and fundamental part of everyday life that it placed significant limitations on the options available to most citizens. And I think regardless of your view on this particular strand of research, I think what I'm really demonstrating here is that this game can take that strand of research and dramatize it and simulate it in a really effective and complex way. So what combats this agency inflation by making the players subject to the constraining forces of state violence, poverty, instability, and also secrecy, a lack of information, and the effects that can have on our decision-making process. It goes a long way towards engaging the public in the question of why so many people have historically been complicit in oppressive regimes, abuses, and atrocities. It provides an examination of the banality of the mundane, everyday jobs and actions required to make an authoritarian regime function, thinking back to the bookkeeper of Auschwitz and the bureaucratic cogs in the machine. Much like Train, it illustrates a system of corrupt and corrupting authoritarian bureaucracy that places significant constraints on human choice and behavior. A system that is crafted and organized to utilize ordinary people in its mission of oppression and control. It helps us answer the question of under what circumstances people become part of the machinery of terror. And this quote from Hannah Arendt, I think, perfectly sums up what both Train and Papers, Please are able to achieve. The essence of totalitarian government, and perhaps the nature of every bureaucracy, is to make functionaries and mere cogs in the administrative machinery out of men and thus to dehumanize them. So could we make a game then perhaps about the grey zone of the Holocaust and some of the unthinkable situations that people were forced to make decisions in this period? Well, I think we absolutely could, but there are, of course, significant limitations and significant tensions in this area. So I've just quickly run through a few of them here. First is the trivialization of the ludic frame. So this idea that framing something as a game rather than as art or literature or etc. Inherently has a trivializing effect. And that's linked to the fact that games are still often seen as a lowbrow medium, not capable of engaging in sophisticated themes and content. Of course, there are ongoing debates about the appropriateness of Holocaust memorialization and representation. This is a huge field, and we'll probably never stop debating and arguing about how it's appropriate to represent the Holocaust, if at all. There's also the factor of anxiety over the playable position. So what this means is that people have this of allowing people to reenact historical abuses in any sort of setting, particularly a digital one. And of course, this is a real danger, you know, like, could we ever let people play as a Nazi? Well, possibly not, because there is this real ethical concern over allowing people to reenact these atrocities in any way. And I'll borrow another quote from Wolfgang here. Is it ethical at all to release the code for a virtual Auschwitz into the world? And of course, there are very practical concerns too about budget, funding, commercial concerns, the actual viability of making a game like this. Games are obviously quite expensive to make, and they take time and resources. There's always limitations on what you can do. And I suspect a game like this would need some considerable funding from an outside source that isn't primarily concerned with making back their investment. Now that I am someone working for a historical game design company, I'm getting a very, very vivid insight into this firsthand. And there are real concerns and problems in how you rectify those different needs. But there are significant opportunities in this space too. So what could we do with digital games and complicity? We could explore choiceless choices, perhaps games that explore the dilemmas of the Sonderkommandos in the camps. I feel like this could be something that we could use these complicity mechanics to do. Breaking down good and bad and wrong and right choice binaries. So did you make the wrong choices? Breaking down these sort of very simplistic binaries that we tend to see reproduced a lot in a lot of sort of more, some possible topics to engage with without needing to necessarily graphically depict the horrors of the camps, resistance and collaboration, especially in everyday and domestic settings, rescue and denunciation, and themes of escape. These are all things that you could do in a digital game and that some people have done or have been trying to do without having to be very graphic and directly depict an extermination camp. So just to conclude and wrap up, what I argue today is that games can present complex and meaningful examinations of decision-making processes of historical actors in unimaginable situations. And through these mechanics of complicity and the simulated problem spaces that we've looked at, there's an opportunity for both empathy and critical historical thinking about the experiences of those complicit in atrocity. So it's not just momentary visceral immersion, which I think has questionable use for games understanding. The way that these games work can, I argue, facilitate historical understanding in the public sphere. And I just want to close on culture that the whole forgotten. We see this headline all the time. But, and also one of the burdens of Holocaust memory is that it's sort of tasked with preventing future genocides as well. But I wonder if the problem is not so much that people are forgetting the Holocaust, but just no longer learning anything new from it. And as Wolfgang Steiner has argued, the Holocaust and its memory culture must embrace digital popular culture in order to continue to perpetuate self-critical never again memory in the 21st century. And I agree that Holocaust memory entering the digital age will hopefully go a long way towards making its lessons continually relevant, powerful, and instructive in the 21st century. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I must say it was also a perfectly timed 20 minutes. So thank you as well for that. Our next speaker is here to my left. His name is Theodor Pelekanidis. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the Freie University in Berlin. He is a theorist of history and historian of the modern period and has previously held postdoc visiting scholar and lecturer positions at the University of Oulu, where he has taught a course about theoretical perspectives of Holocaust historiography. Mr. Pelekanidis received his PhD in history from the Humboldt University in Berlin in 2021, analyzing the implications of postmodern theory in historiography with a special focus on the Holocaust and genocide. His work has appeared in Clio, History and the Philosophy of History, Historien, and his book about how to write about the Holocaust, the postmodern theory of history in practice, will appear with Routledge later this year. The floor is yours.
So, thank you.
You can share your slides.
Yeah, I will do this also. How?
So,
Get out?
you have your stick on there?
Yeah. I go out?
Yeah, go to that map. You go to the drive. You click open your slideshow. All right, but you're not sharing it yet. Now you go to Zoom,
Okay, yeah. I
and
see.
then you share your screen. Wait, here is Zoom. No. This is your slideshow or this one?
This one.
Okay, so, and now we'll put it on large. No, it should be working.
Okay, so hello, and thank you for being here. I would like to start with two preliminary remarks actually. The first one is a big thank you for the network and the organizers here of the conference. This hybrid format has been quite challenging, so it was amazing. I'm really impressed. And the second one is that I might disappoint some because my presentation does not have to do with the digital. When I first submitted, of course, it had to do, it was still a draft of my last chapter of the dissertation, but now that it's completed and it's already in the book, it is not. So that might be disappointing for some, saying that the digital is a big topic. But yeah, I feel also out of place. It was my mistake. I didn't see the title of the panel that I was in. I just saw the date and the other people that were talking with me. I was like, I know them, so they must be fine. So, sorry for that. Now that's out of the way, I can start. So, I will talk about the Holocaust. I can ask you to use your imagination maybe and think how these characteristics can be used in digital forms. I do this, but I'm not an expert in order to say that. So, you can stay with me while I will analyze the book, The Kindly Ones, which is a literature book. And so the presentation has two parts. First, I would like to talk a little bit about modernist writing, which I got familiar with through Hayden White, but as I suppose everybody is familiar with the work of Hayden White, I would like to see it from another viewpoint a little bit, just briefly, and then I'm going to try to apply the characteristics of modernist writing to the book, The Kindly Ones, and see what it can offer to historical knowledge. So that's all not useful. So, Hayden White, as you all know, I imagine he has used this term, the modernist event, in order to describe events of the 20th century that could not have happened earlier. And Holocaust, for example, was one of them, the primary one maybe, also the nuclear attacks. He also had the view to say that the climate change is also one of the modernist events. And his idea was that we need a new form of writing in order to be able to approach, to grasp, and to represent these events. So the problem is, for me, that when I first read the modernist event, and when I also try to put it into the context of White's effort to make us realize the connection, the relationship between the literature and historiography, I was not really persuaded by this connection that he makes. I found there is a logical gap, because I could not really find how he can say that, just like this, using just some examples, and no sufficient argumentation, in my opinion, that we need new ways of writing in order to be able to narrate new events. So I was trying to find out if there is a debate in the literature, in literary cycles about this, because I realized that although White wrote a lot about literary theory, if you only read White, you will not learn literary theory. So I tried to, and I found a very interesting text actually from Virginia Woolf that I did not find cited in White, although I suppose he was familiar with it. The text is, the essay is called Modern Fiction, so it's an essay, it's not a literature book. So Virginia Woolf, of course, she was one of the most prominent authors of modernism. And in this book, this essay, published in 1925, first it was published in 1919, but the version, the most complete, is in 1925, she was actually criticizing the authors of her generation, that they were using methods and techniques of literary writing that were outdated, that they could not grasp the realities of the world after the First World War, and what new technology has, or she had like, she really liked airplanes, for example, and so on. So the new way of living, and she thought that romanticist writing, for example, could not really grasp this new reality. And she proposed then that modernism, like James Joyce's modernism, this kind of writing, was the only one that could really fit in the demands of her age. And when I saw this and I realized that there was actually in the 1920s a literary debate about what modernism is, how it can affect the way we see the world if we really write in this way. This was the first time that I got persuaded that, okay, Hayden White was actually basing what he said on something that I could get familiar with, so people who knew about modernism from its start. And just also to mention, because you will see that maybe I will not have the opportunity to mention it later, none of these writers say that we should only write in this modernist way. I think it would be very sad if we only had modernist writing, because they are very hard. They are extremely hard to read. We also need some more easy things to read. But still, it is this avant-garde way of writing. Can really, I also believe, I am persuaded for this, can really grasp the realities of the modern age. And I believe also that these characteristics of modernist writing, if applied to historical, not only historiography, but in general to everything that we find that represents or mediates the Holocaust, and here the parenthesis, you can also think about any digital form, could be much more effective in making us understand or connect emotionally, or have a more wide knowledge and understanding of the Holocaust, for example. And here I will just read the 5 characteristics of modernist writing that Hayden White took from Erich Auerbach. And these are, firstly, the disappearance of the writer as a narrator of objective facts. Secondly, the dissolution of any viewpoint, the predominance of a tone of doubt and questioning, the employment of devices such as the internal monologue, and the use of new techniques of the representation of the experience of time and temporality. And I would like to go to my case, so the book The Kindly Ones by Jonathan Littell. It was written in 2007 by the French author Jonathan Littell, and it is a book that has become very controversial and also successful, has been translated in many languages, has been widely read, but has also initiated controversy. I have listened to historians who actually find it extremely good, like a history book, and I have read others, like Ulrich Herbert here, that have characterized as boring. It has won also literary prizes, which shows its literary value. And by reading, for example, not only Ulrich Herbert's review of the book, but also others, like one by Dominique Lecapra, etc. So there are historians who actually wrote about the book, they engaged with it, they wrote 1,000 pages, and then they sat down and wrote about it, which shows already that it has historiographical importance. I believe that, for example, why Ulrich Herbert says that it's boring, the characters are made of wood, the narration is constructed and resembles a light fiction, and so on. He did not really want to criticize the literal value of the book. What he wants to say, and this becomes clear in the review, is that people who say that it has historiographical value, they are wrong, because in order for a book to have historiographical value, it needs to have more depth, I would say. And this is what I would like to discuss. If we really need this sophistication in this way, in a literary text, and not an historiographical one, in order to say that it is an efficient way to represent the Holocaust. So what is the book? What's the historiographical value of the book? It's a historical novel, of course, about the Second World War. The protagonist is a Nazi officer. He is also a homosexual, which plays a big role in the book. He has dubious connections with the German industry, and he is also very well educated and so on. So he's a likable character if you forget that he's a Nazi officer. And he is also portrayed like this by Littell. The historiographical value of the book lies in the fact that it refers to historical events with great accuracy, and he analyzes in depth that would not be necessarily expected by a literature book, but this we can find in many historical novels. The important thing is that Littell, and the narrator actually, does not hesitate to take part in historiographical debates. And he does it through this device. So the narrator actually writes, after many years after the end of the Second World War, he's in France, and he is, so to say, an amateur historian of the Holocaust. So he reads a lot of books about the Holocaust, and he has this ability to cite Holocaust historians like Raoul Hilberg, and also take a position in historiographical debates. For example, he has many mentions about the connections between the Holocaust and genocide in general, about the post-colonial world order. He makes many comments throughout the book. He also participates in the debate in the 80s and 90s about intentionalism and functionalism. He's an extreme functionalist, the narrator. But although it has this historiographical value that I at least see, and many other historians and reviewers have diagnosed in this book, it is true that what Dominic Lacabra said, that the character is actually ahistorical. He is blatantly implausible, and he has been termed a Zelig figure. So he just has all the qualities that he needs in order to be part of the book. He seems to have participated in virtually every major incident of the war and the genocide. So he was in Poland, he was in Stalingrad, he was in Ukraine during Babi Yar, he was then in the extermination camps. He was almost everywhere where Littell needs him in order to tell the story. And for Dominic Lacabra, for example, this ahistorical, this is something that reduces the historiographical value of the book. It may be so, but I have an example I took it not from Tacitus, actually. I have never read Tacitus, but Erich Auerbach, in his book Mimesis, I think the second chapter, he used a very nice example to show the literary characters, literary features of historical writing. And he says that there is an event Tacitus describes in the Roman army. After battle, there's a peasant who goes and starts talking to the army. He gives a speech to the army. And from this, we can take many information about the Roman army, about the Roman society in general, and so forth. So it's a valuable historical description, and it also has a significant literary value. The thing is that the character, the peasant, is extremely ahistorical and implausible, because peasants would not give speeches in the Roman army. There are other people to do this. But still, we wouldn't say that Tacitus' work is not a historical work. I mean that what I found in Ulrich Herbert, I also found Dominic Lacabra. I find that they exaggerate in how the book does not give. That does not have historiographical significance, because they try to undermine the historical elements of the book, the historiographical elements, something that I think is not that important, because there are positive things in the book that we should just try to combine them with the fact that it's a historical novel and not a historical book. So I really appreciate the thing that he can cite and he can participate in debates, and I don't think that the fact that the character is historical is so important in order to say that, no, it doesn't have any significance at all. The other critique in the book is that the contribution to historical debates are disputable and outdated. So outdated, I suppose, they have to be in a way, because even if they were not outdated, even if the book was written in the 90s, when the debate between functionalists and intentionalists was still harsh, I don't think that anybody would take it as part of the debate. And the other thing is that people tend, and I would not expect that from historians, but the narrator is not the same person as the author. So in order for the narrator to be a Nazi officer who tries to justify himself in front of the audience for what he did, I do not see any other way of him trying to explain the events other than the functionalist way. So the intentionalist way would be like to say, yeah, we had a plan. There was one time that I got in the Nazi party and they told me, you know what, we have 5 things. One of them is we're going to kill all the Jews. It would be the intentionalist. Then the extreme intentionalist. He takes the extreme functionalist view, which says that no, everything was a mistake. I went to the concentration camp and I saw that, wow, here is everything wrong. We win the workforce and we kill them. Still, the debate between historians is not concluded, but now most of them are moderate, so they are somewhere in between. They would not go with the functionalist approach that we can find in Gates Alley, for example, or in Jonathan Littell and his narrator. But I believe that that also does not undermine the historiographical value of the book, because it's a literary device in order for the character to really build his story and make it believable, make the character believable. So now I have 5 more minutes, and I would just like to try to apply these modernist writing characteristics with the actual book and see. Well, we saw that the book, so as I tried to show, it has historiographical value. I will try to test in a way if modernist writing is part of it and if it really helps us understand the Holocaust better than narration that would not have modernist elements. And here, for example, the disappearance of the writer as narrator of objective facts, we can find it, and this is the favorite part, the favorite thing in this book for me, is that we have an amazing way that Littell uses the device, the narrative device of the unreliable narrator. And he does it in a way that from the beginning we are not sure if we should trust the guy or not. At first we don't know he's a Nazi officer. He seems very likable. He says some things that are quite provocative, but still I thought that, oh, a nice guy. Then we learn that he's a Nazi officer. We say, okay, maybe I should not trust what he says. Then, while the book goes on, we try to understand what he's going through and so on. He becomes likable again. And then his actions make us again think about, should we trust the guy, should we not? And in the end, we are living in this two-sided world. We kind of think, well, what he says seems like it's true, and on the other hand, we think, no, he just tries to deceive us in order to justify his actions. He's a very bad person. And with this device, we can understand much better the role of the perpetrators, I think. And it is a device that, it is a modernist writing feature that I believe can help us understand better the role of the perpetrators and the whole process of the Holocaust. Then in the dissolution of any viewpoint, the character, as I said, is so implausible. He has so many viewpoints. He suffers from trauma. He also got injured seriously in the battle. He is always in a situation where he does not understand what happens. He's sick and so on. And so he really does not have any viewpoint. He's just a lost person in a world that just falls. And on the other hand, you can see that many times Littell achieves to bring many, many viewpoints, like from the Hungarians, from the Poles, from the Germans, from the French, in just one sentence. I don't think that the dissolution of any viewpoint can be found in every aspect of the book. But I believe that this feature of modernist writing can be found in some of the book's chapters. And it also helps us understand better how the Holocaust, and in general the Eastern Front was, or better to say, how nobody could really make sense of what was going on there, this feeling of loss. Okay, then the predominance of a doubt, tone of doubting and questioning. I don't know. I don't have much time now. I don't want to repeat myself. Again, I think that the fact that we talk about an imaginative fictional character that partakes in a war where he does not know exactly what's going on adds to this tone of doubt and questioning. Internal monologues can be found throughout the book. And the time and temporality, he suffers from a head trauma, our protagonist. So he really has flashbacks all the time, so he goes back and forth. I believe that there is a brilliant use of techniques about the presentation of time. So now, let me conclude. This is the book, yeah. Let me conclude because I'm now 20 minutes. My conclusion, I suppose, is that although the book is not the most modernist book that one can find. Samuel Beckett is much more modernist. James Joyce is, of course, much more modernist. It's a simple book with modern characteristics that sold a lot. But I still believe that we don't always need to the most complicated thing in order to lead us, to show us the way how we can represent complex events. Of course, historical knowledge is important, and Littell made use of it throughout the book. I think he read, I don't know how many books about the Holocaust he read in order to write the kindly ones. But sometimes I feel that in academia we need to play very, very sophisticated, and we try to find very, very complicated things in order to show how we should go forth and analyze events. And in the simplicity of this book, The Kindly Ones, that is easily read, although it's 1,000 pages, I found an answer on how actually we can use literary devices in order to make historical events that are particularly complex become easily to understand for the wider publics. Thank you.
You can stop sharing your screen. You can stop sharing your screen. Thank you very much, Dr. Pelekanidis, for this talk. I don't think apologies at the beginning were necessary. I think you fit in perfectly well within this panel. So thank you. I'm sure we'll have plenty to discuss. But first, let's listen to Lars Deile, if I pronounce that correctly. He's an assistant professor for didactics and theory of history at the University of Bielefeld in Germany. His PhD thesis was focused on the impact of Georg Steinhausen on the development of cultural history as a discipline around 1900, and he has also worked on the experience of time in festivity culture around 1800. He has likewise taught history in English for school children before he started focusing on history didactics and questions of historical learning and historical thinking. His current work focuses on designing settings for historical learning by focusing on the moment of experience in the process of historical thinking. Today, he will speak about observing hologram testimony. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just have to start screen sharing and try to find the right share.
Did you already open your PowerPoint? It's not that one.
It's that one.
Otherwise, we can go back to the desktop and find it there.
It's this one.
It is? Okay, fantastic. Right. And then if you click presentation mode right in the corner there. Yeah, that.
This one.
Yeah, that. Exactly. It will show up bigger. And now you can
Brilliant.
go. Great.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marie-Gabrielle, for this kind introduction. It's always funny to hear one's own story or history. Let me start with an example or an advert of what I'm talking about.
My name is Pinchas Gutter. I will answer any questions you might have for me.
How old were you when the war ended?
I was between the ages of 13 and 14 when the war ended in 1945.
We just go on. I think you had already a glimpse what is happening there of the project, what I'm talking about. And maybe it's even better if this sounds back and forward again. I didn't plan this, but it makes it even better. Imagine I would have started like this. My name is Lars Deile. I am from Bielefeld, an historian. I might answer any questions you might have for me. Would you like to ask me any questions about my life? Probably you have left the Zoom or the room because you might have thought that I just pretend to have, first of all, no point. If you can ask me any question, that means I have no point to make. Otherwise, on the other side, you could have thought that I pretend to know everything, like a Wikipedia on, if you can ask me any question, you might have thought that I'm just overdoing. And that's why I would say both of this is nonsense, and this is exactly my point. Maybe I'm too harsh on this, but of course I'm not only talking about me, but also about the project. My immediate reaction was exactly this. This is just nonsense. And it was a situation or a feeling of rejection. And since I have come with this project for the first time, I'm thinking about, am I just another Ulrich Herbert, who is just blaming the book to be a bad book, badly written, it's just not thrilling, but underneath he's just criticizing the book of what it has done, writing the book out of the perspective of a perpetrator, and that is the real scandal behind it, and this is what Theo figured out. So am I just too old to cope with the new condition of historicity, which we have in another panel and which we had already yesterday? Am I just ignoring and rejecting it because out of I'm thinking there's a taboo broken? And like Kate, I want to work on this experience of rejection. A short outline of what I'm doing. In the first part, I want to reflect on this hologram testimony project from a point of view of historic theory. And in a second, I want to have a closer look of historic learning purposes and how this project can meet them. I start with the first one. Of course, this is a technical challenge. To have 600 bulbs of light, to have 116 camera, to streamline automatic speech recognition, natural language processing, to find a computer which can do this all. There are similar projects to the one which I'm referring here. The colleagues in Munich did the same thing with one interview, with creating one hologram testimony, and they had really a hard job to find a computer which could work on this in the whole of Munich. So it is fascinating also to consider what question future generation would have to Holocaust survivors. But isn't this not only nothing more than a nerdy academic and engineering game? I would say that content steps back behind the technical challenge, but to understand this much better, I want to unfold two arguments which deal with it as a problem. First of all, I would say this is no history. Why? Davina Pardo, a filmmaker in New York, has made a wonderful movie on how it's called, that's wrong, it's 116 cameras and not 361, I don't know how I came to that. She has made a wonderful movie on this, how Eva Schloss, one of the Holocaust survivors, became a hologram testimony. And we'll try it again with a movie, and it will not work again, but yes.
This is a repeat after me. My name is Eva Schloss, and I'm a Holocaust survivor.
My name is Eva Schloss. I'm a Holocaust
Yeah, I
survivor.
like it very much because I have a transcript of what's going on. It doesn't matter, you know. I just shared the wrong version. What she's saying here is exactly this. It shows us how this thing is produced. There's a producer, and the producer starts like this. Please repeat after me. My name is Eva Schloss, and I'm a Holocaust survivor. And Eva, being filmed in this filming dome, replies, my name is Eva Schloss and I'm a Holocaust survivor. Next one, I'm actually a recording, so I can't answer that question. Eva, I'm actually a recording, I can't answer that question. I don't remember. Maybe you should try to reboot, and there it comes really interesting. Maybe you should try to, and Eva didn't understand it right. Reboot, says the director. Reboot? Reboot. Anyway, and she says again, rebook. Ha ha ha, too technical for me. What you see here is, and it's very interesting, please repeat after me, repetition. Is history just nothing like repetition? Maybe an everyday understanding would be exactly like this. Keeping something in mind. This is what teachers always try in school to teach, and they often teach history like this. Gabrielle maybe does it better, I have done it like this. Make a repetition of some facts, and this is then history. I would say history is something very different. History is something situational. History is driven by questions. History needs difference. It needs the working on clashes and gaps, like Alison has pointed out with regard to Benjamin yesterday. This is then something completely different than we have here. Interesting enough, Eva Schloss started in 1986 to tell her story. This is a long time after what she is talking about, what she has survived and what she has experienced during the Second World War and during the Holocaust. In 1986, she started to go to schools and to tell her story to school children. This is something which is happening very much since then, and what the Visual History Archive did in 1996, facing the fact that Eva and others soon will not be able to go to schools and tell their story anymore, was to recording. This is this Steven Spielberg project. I think, Ethan, you worked for them as well for when you were a student, haven't you? Brilliant. What they were doing was to video filming these survivors to create video testimony, to have it also for a time when these people would have died. This is already a change. Eva had a point to make when she went to school to tell her story. She told, I would say what she was doing history, because this was situational. It could be asked. She had a point to make. It was driven by questions, and it was a rather dialogical discourse situation. The videos which are produced or were produced by the Visual History Archive are something different. They are not a history of the same matter. They are just a recording of something, a creation of research, of a resource which could become a matter of research and of questioning. Her interview is 4 hours long. No school children would sit down and watch all this video. And maybe this is also one point why the same institution was creating in 2016 this hologram testimony, which, and this is the very difference, and you saw it in the transcription, is a codification of one narration. They asked her about 1,000 questions, and it was not that she answered these questions, but a group of didactics, of historians, decided out of the video testimony what could be the appropriate answer. And then she just had to record these answers. And out of this set of 1,000 answers, now people could ask questions. This is a codification of one narration, even though it doesn't look like that. Only short questions are possible, only short answers are given. And this is also something very special, and this is nothing what history is. I would say with Ulrich Rauf, who said, history is what we are not ready yet with, or what we are not finished yet with. But this exactly does the opposite. It finishes up something. Second point, which I would criticize, among others, authorship. Here again to the transcript, the video history archive. No, the new dimensions in history is a set of questions and answers, but there is a hidden author behind. You can't see that. It looks like as if you could ask a hologram or a supposed to be authentic person, but actually there is a hidden author behind that, and you as the consumer or the reader or the observer are not able to look behind this. And this is also maybe different to literature, where you already know, okay, I have bought a fictional book, there is written novel on it, and I know what I can expect. But here, there is a simulation of authenticity, which it is not. It is also, I would say, an occupation of future generation questions, because today we already define what can be the questions of tomorrow. We tried it out yesterday because Kate and Timony talked about the same thing, and we tried it out with a question like, do you like pizza? And they just reply, I can't answer this question. And Berber had a better answer, do you still feel pain about this time, or something like this? And there was a long answer given, and it shows that they try to pretend what the questions and answers of future generations would be. And I doubt that this makes any sense. And by the way, the advert we saw in the very beginning, only a short glimpse of that, shows us youngsters who are really willing to ask questions. They are sitting there, raising their hand and asking brave questions. Do you remember a song of your childhood? Oh yes, I do remember a song of my childhood. And then they start like this. I mean, Gabrielle maybe has better students in Colombia. When I was working as a teacher, I never saw school children like that. And it's good like that. How much time do I have? I don't want to overstress Benjamin. 8 minutes, okay, we can try it. When I came about thinking of authorship, I was thinking of Benjamin. I don't know why, because it's such a hard text, and I always try to understand it again and again. And the automaton story in Benjamin's Über den Begriff der Geschichte goes like this. The story is told of an automaton constructed in such a way that it could play a winning game of chess, answering each move of an opponent with a counter move. A puppet in Turkish attire and with a hookah in its mouth, set before a chessboard placed on a large table. A system of mirrors created the illusion that this table was transparent from all sides. Actually, a little hunchback who was an expert chess player sat inside and guided the puppet's hand by means of strings. On the left side, you saw how this automaton looked like, because it really existed, of what Benjamin is talking like that. And this is exactly what we have here. We have the project authors hidden, like the hunchback sitting in the box, invisible to those who play the game, and they only see this puppet doing something. And I very much like this comparison to Benjamin, even though I don't want to stress it. I only want to use it to underline this point of the hidden author. Benjamin, I mean, there is ... it goes on. He only claims that material history would become good if it had made visible its theological background. And this is also what our Holocaust testimony does not show. It does not show the political or the philosophical assumptions which the whole project makes. And this is something I would criticize. Maybe I'm just performing like the gatekeeper. Marnie Hughes Warrington yesterday said, when we talk about the future historiography and historicity, new modes and maybe a new subtle side which needs new modes of historiography. Maybe I'm just overdoing and performing a gamekeeper in saying history has to be like this. It has to be an author which can be criticized and put into a discourse and dialogue. And it has somehow not only give short answers on short questions, but combine a narration, combine phrases or facts to narration, which is a sense-making process, which can be questioned again. Maybe I'm just too old and Marnie would know it better. And I really try to put a positive point in this by looking on educational opportunity. This project is really, and also if you watch this website, is really out on facing school children, facing teachers to use it as an educational instance. Definitely there would there's a need for much more research on the perception of these hologram testimonies, either in museums and also on the websites. We don't have enough on that. Wolf talked about immersion. Is this meant to be to create a situation of immersion, sitting in front of something which can almost answer you any questions? I mean, in Japan, there are hologram pop stars, and people just get wild on that. Is that maybe a possibility? I would say in educational circumstances, immersion is a good method, but I would say that it never should go without consciousness about the reflection on why we are getting involved, and it shouldn't be a standalone, I would say. I would say that it is necessary only for also for educational purposes, that experience of time goes always with both, with the experience of difference and similarity. And maybe the book is much better because it plays all the time with this. Littell always addresses you as the reader, and it is always, I think, a movement. The reading movement is something of pushing it back and anticipating, taking the point of the narrator, and in the same way rejecting it. And by this, there is a mood of mobility and created, which is the point in which you have to find your position to it, and in which you a learning situation could start with. One thing also which might be possible, agency. You don't have to ask this a hologram all the 1,000 questions. You can only ask the questions you are interested in. And subjectivity and subject focus learning settings are very important in educational discussion. But this is only a part of agency, because it's a limited agency. It is bound, its borders are set by the invisible power behind it. You cannot ask any questions. For instance, do you like pizza? It doesn't give you an answer. It gives you only the answer which are already pre-recorded. So the best thing which could be done, I would say, is to distance to it. And this is maybe a possibility. When you're sitting face to face, a Holocaust survivor will not ask him or her the question, do you like pizza? Or which kind of girls do you like? Or any other questions, which, for instance, my children ask when they are playing with Alexa or things like that. They're just talking nonsense to them. You cannot talk nonsense to a Holocaust survivor. And you probably should not talk nonsense to a Holocaust survivor. I don't know. I think this will change, but the good thing to the video testimonies was already to have this distance. You can talk openly with others about it, and this creates a situation that you can also historicize it. But it doesn't need to this distance doesn't need to be bridged. This gap doesn't have to need bridged like the hologram does. So the best thing I would say also with this project is to historicize it and to reflect on it and its possibilities and hindrances, like Kate called them yesterday. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lars, for a great presentation. It's always a pleasure when technical malfunctions are actually a pleasure to the speaker. So thank you for that as well. We now have some time, and I think we have plenty of time actually for questions. I'll look at the people at home perhaps first. Is there anyone who would like to ask any of our speakers a question? Yes, please go ahead.
Oh, me?
Yes, you. I can't read your name. I'm sorry.
Pedro,
I'm Pedro. I have presented yesterday, I think, and it was a pleasure to. I'm from Brazil, and it was a pleasure to catch all these talks. I have questions for Lars and Tamika, and I'll try to be brief. And regarding Lars, I really like the way you read these testimonies, but I actually kind of disagree with the conclusions. And I would like to present another reading of what you said, which is, I think you're correct regarding how uncanny these testimonies are, but it seems to me that the uncanniness is more of the way they are used and the questions we as historians make about them than regarding the testimonies themselves. Because it seems to me that the problem with these hologram testimonies is that it clashes the logics of recording with the logics of testimony. And I mean, I'm thinking of Paul Ricoeur when he says that testimony points to the future because it could be changed or it is maintained from one iteration to another. But in this case, why it is something so different from when we record a person telling their experience. In this case, we can't also change the testimony from the person. So the question is more the way we interact with this testimony than a problem with the testimony itself. And thus, to conclude my argument, I don't think there is a question of what history is, which is the openness to change. But this question seems to me, this is my reading, it seems to me that we can only think that this is not what history is if we conflate history with testimony. But history is always the revision of fixed historical sources. The sources doesn't change, but the question change. And you are right, we cannot have answers. We cannot receive answers from these testimonies that are not already programmed, but we can make those questions. And this is history, or this should be history. So I know this may seem kind of challenging, but it is something like some noise, some dissonance in my reception of your paper that seemed very, very clear to me. But thanks for the work, and I really enjoy your presentation. And to Tamika, I have lots of questions actually, but I really enjoy your presentation. But I was thinking, it seemed to me, I wish you could speak a little bit more about the relationship between historical narrative, historical representation, and ethics, which was a major topic. But it seemed to me that even if these games try to deepen and question the complicity and conformity with these social systems, they nonetheless do not determine the political character of the narrative. So gameplay does not involve necessarily an ethical position, but is also to use the same word, the clash between gameplay, what gameplay determines or makes it possible, and what we understand of what is living in a dictatorship, or what we understand of the Holocaust that causes the clash. So I would like to hear more about this topic from you. And I also really enjoy your presentation. Thank you.
Great. I suggest maybe we take also Alison's question, and then you can answer, both of you.
I want to thank all of the panelists for those really provocative papers. I have questions for Tamika and for Lars. Tamika, I thought your presentation was really fascinating, and I have gone back and forth in my mind about what I think about video games, and I think you make a pretty strong case for some of the value here. But what I wonder about really are the stakes. If it's possible to ever make the stakes of the decisions significant enough that the kind of sort of ethical quandary that we're meant to engage could actually take place. So I mean, that's a question that I have. And I also wanted to suggest a recent book by Mihaela Mihai. I don't know if you know this book. It's called Political Memory and the Aesthetics of Care. And basically what she's trying to do in that book is to explain the way that both resistance and complicity are impure, you know, and that neither is, that they're on a spectrum with one another. And she's trying to de-individualize both complicity and resistance. But I think it would work. I mean, I think it would work really well with the kind of argument that you're trying to make. My question for Lars, I'm very sympathetic to your reading of the holograms. And I think for me, it's pretty much what you suggest, that it seems like there's a kind of seamlessness that's being presented, right? One's not aware of the mediation, or the mediation is being hidden. And I think, you know, for there to be anything that's sort of like resembling historical thinking, one, as you say, has to be aware of the fact that they are thinking historically, right? You know, you need that kind of like self-reflexivity. And so what I wanted to ask you about is how you see the difference between video testimonies and the holograms, right? Because they seem quite different to me, even though structurally they're both sort of representations that you're encountering. And obviously, to me, I mean, I think you've already started to get at this and to get at the problem with the hologram. But what is it about the video testimony that doesn't cause a similar kind of problem? Because I don't think that the video testimonies cause the same kinds of problems myself.
Great. I'll give the word first to Tamika.
Okay, hi. Thank you both so much for your really thoughtful and interesting questions. I'll respond to Pedro's first. So hopefully I've understood you correctly, but what you're saying is that, you know, there isn't necessarily a political position embedded in the gameplay of these games, so they leave it quite open. And I agree with that. And I think that can be a strength of these games, I would hypothesize. So I would say gameplay is just a tool like anything else. So gameplay is, we can think of it the same way we use language or the same way we use an image. So gameplay can hold whatever argument you want to program into it. So in Papers, Please, and there are similar games like This War of Mine that are quite sort of open simulations that deal with these ethical issues. They do leave it up to the player to determine for themselves what the political character of the narrative is. And to me, that's kind of what I love about it. I think if they wanted to, they could probably program a more political statement or a stronger ethical position in them. But I think that the idea is that it is an iterative process that depends on the player input. And they do program themselves in a way that there are multiple interpretations that the player can take from them. So yeah, I definitely think that you make a really excellent observation. There are games that have more open ethical and political positions and games that are a bit more didactic or a bit more decisive. So I think perhaps perhaps Papers, Please in particular is more open, because there's something like 20 different endings of the game. So depending on your actions, you can come to a lot of different outcomes. So I think that, obviously the game might reinforce certain positions more than others. I think it's impossible for it to be completely open. Of course, it's encoded by humans, and there's always going to be implicit biases and unconscious agendas and philosophies that are embedded within. But I think that there's definitely a spectrum of how deterministic the ethical and political positions can be in gameplay compared to how open they might be. Hopefully that sort of answers your question. I'm not sure, but thanks for raising that. Now, Alison, thank you so much for your comment and your question on my presentation as well. I will look up that book, absolutely. I want to pick up the word that you said about de-individualizing. If I'm interpreting this correctly, if this book is talking about how resistance and complicity are not necessarily individual choices, but they take place in a system. And I think that's what I would really love to emphasize about both of my case studies. They really do show that these things are not purely individual choices. So they're anti-individualistic enough, not anti, but they de-individualize these acts by showing this sort of the web of resistance, or the webs of complicity, and all of the factors that exert pressure on these concepts and the ability to actually undertake them. Now, your question about the stakes and whether we can make them significant enough that we actually do confront these ethical quandaries, whether that can take place, that is a really great and a really complex issue. I don't know if I can give a yes or no answer, because it's hard. But what I can say is that in one dimension, some of my research has been in this realm, and what I've come across is that players do feel guilt. They do feel immersed enough often in the gameplay that they do actually feel emotions that are triggered by what happens. So if we look at certain games, players have been studied and interviewed after they play them, and if they've been forced to do some, challenging things. I think Spec Ops: The Line is a game that's been studied a lot in this case. I don't know if anyone has heard of that game, but players will play through it, and you end up being complicit in some terrible war crimes in this game, and they do feel guilty. So there is an emotional impact. There is some sort of affective immersion in these games. Now, obviously, we can't ever represent what it was actually like to go through these experiences. Playing a game where you are complicit in some sort of, crime against humanity is always going to be worlds away from what actually happened, the actual real experience. And these are abstractions as well at the end of the day. They are abstractions, that they are not meant to capture the full lived experience of it. But I would argue that nothing really can. Like we watch a film or we read a book, even a history book about any of these things, and they can't put us there. They can't put us in that place. So, maybe we're reading a book about these ethical quandaries, and we have to use our imagination to think about what it might have been like. And I think that because of this sort of immersive but also critical potential of games, maybe they can even get us closer than words on a page or images, which is not to denigrate either of those options, but just to say that, there are different strengths there as well. So I hope that's answered your question as well. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Great, thank you for those answers, Lars.
It's very difficult to put into words, but thank you very much for the questions. Actually, one experience here in the room is that we have a screen over there. You see a screen maybe there if you have the other point of view. And I have a computer in front of me where I saw you very small. And when I was trying to listen to your questions, I was listening to the voice here in the room, which is somehow also a little bit echoing. I was looking on this very small screen, and this kind of experience is very important, and it's also important of experiences, the different kind of sources. I would consider these things, when you face Eva Schloss personally talking to her, when you see her on the video which had been recorded as testimony, or when you see her as hologram, it's completely a different experience, all these three forms. It's also different kind of sources And it's also different what these sources can be sources for. I mean, it is widely accepted, I would say, among oral history that people are talking about the past, but these situations are more a source for the memories of these peoples of these past. I mean, they are talking like 40 years after the event, and it's rather more a source for the memory. Now, when it becomes a video, it is already transformed into another kind of source, I would say, but it's still very close to this situation. But there is a distance which you have. I mean, you can sit in front of a screen watching this video testimony and talking to a neighbor or to another researcher or to a friend or whatever, and you can also talk about things which you would never face to the real person, because I mean, they're kind of taboos. They're sitting you and overwhelming you, and the video is not overwhelming you in the same way. So I think this was maybe the biggest advantage compared to the personal testimony. But I think there is no necessity to turn this again into a closer experience again, and it loses just its power which it had as a video testimony. Behind all these, there are fears. To turn it into video testimony, there is the fear that these people will die and be not able to talk to us anymore. And the use of testimony, of personal testimonies, but also of the video testimonies, was always something like recording something, but on the other side also a pedagogical issue, that if you face a person who has survived really terrible things in life, you might become a good person yourself. Well, it doesn't actually work like this completely. And the second is, if it doesn't work, what can we do then to stress this point, this pedagogical point again? And the experience that no youngster who is used to watch short clips on YouTube or wherever will watch a 4-hour testimony is to change it and to create something where elderly people think that youngsters will like this technical approach. And I think this is behind, and I think it completely fails, because Kate was the only one of us who are talking on this conference who saw this hologram in the display in the Illinois Holocaust Educational Center. And she says, it's just terrible to see how people deal with it. They need a mediator who transforms your questions to questions with the hologram can answer. And it's just, there is a distance which is already not facing the educational purposes which it is supposed to, of course, to face. I would say it's just different kind of sources for different kind of things, but definitely most of them not for the situation to learn something about the Holocaust itself. But this is exactly what it is pretending, and the hologram is pretending it most. Like that.
Great, thank you for that answer. I see we have 2 more questions from people at home, which I think is great, but perhaps we should first take one for Theodor, so all the speakers get a question. So is there anyone who has a question for him? I see some hands here in the room, so I'll give the word to, I think you were first. Just one moment, please.
Okay, now we're good. Hi, I'm Ilkka Lähtemäki, for you who can't see me.
No, we'll see you soon.
This is for Theo, but I would also like to hear Tamika's take on the issue, because I'm interested in this ahistorical part of both of these cases. In Theo's case, it's the main character who's, basically impossible, or implausible at least. So is this a mechanism that's universal, that we can actually use to represent pretty much everything? or deal with historical questions, or is this specific to the sort of modern cases which we feel that we can somehow personally reflect upon? So do we lose the meaning at some point that if you start using, modern person in, I don't know, 16th century or something? And this goes, of course, the same situation with the games, because we have the, modern player with modern morals, and we put them in moral situations which are from not of our current present, but somehow relatable still to it. So do they lose their value as a sort of ethical tool and questioning, or become more like a comical situation at some point? So in this, is this actually a truly, proper way to do any kind of historical discussion? Or is it specific to now, Holocaust or the sort of horror cases that we have? Thanks.
Thanks for that question. I suggest we take a few others from here in the room.
Thank you. Well, first off, there was something really interesting about the three papers working together, because you have two instances of an attempt at a kind of hyper-realism. One in the case of the games, of course, which is fantastic, and you sort of know it's fantastic, so the hyper-realism's clear, or maybe not. And then the other, of course, the hyperrealism meant to create this immediate experience with a person who's not there. But in between, and so the question's for Theo, you have this other case where the historical trappings are made, every note is hit. Anyone who has read or studied National Socialism and the Holocaust would recognize. And then you have a character who's dropped into it. And so this sort of hyperrealism is always made too much. So you know it's too much. You have this alienation effect, to think of Brecht. But the question I have has to do with more the literary aspect of le bienveillant, the kindly ones, because it really, in one way, of course, it's set explicitly in this moment, but it's the Oresteia. The story is the Oresteia that's happening here. The kindly ones are the Furies transformed once justice is enacted in Athens. But it's not just the kindly ones, and here's the modernist part, it's Blanchot and the Most High, which itself is a revision or a retelling of the Oresteia. And then you have this one, so one, of course, is a story of justice. One, of course, is a story about the absence of God or the disappearance of God. And there's one line in the kindly ones that always sticks in my head about this law student who has worked on law his whole life, has then entered into this choice to be a participant in this endeavor, which is legal, but perhaps not moral. And it's toward the end, and the question is, who's to judge when the courts have all been burned, right? And in some ways, the story seems to be much more about, to my mind, trying to work through that question, whether there is anything left over, whether there are any kindly ones at this point. So the question is really whether, how do I put this? Whether this is an instantiation of what White claimed to be the modernist, the need for a modernist variant on talking about the Holocaust, or whether, in fact, this is a result of White telling us this. That White says we need a modernist frame, and then Littell writes it in a modernist way, even though it's definitely postmodern. It's not Wolff, it's 100 years later. And so that's the question that I have, is whether it's an instantiation of what White was saying about the ways we need to talk about the Holocaust, or whether, in fact, it's a result of White's mediation.
Thanks for that question. Wolf was also wanting to ask one. You can come later. Perfect. Then I suggest you answer.
Okay.
With the mic.
So I will start with Ilka. Well, out of the top of my head now, I would say that we find such a historical characters in the literature about anything. So it's something common. I mean, what in this case is significant is this unreliability, and at the same time No, this maybe is very postmodern. That on the one hand, you have an unreliable narrator who, both because of what he's doing, his role in the war and in the Holocaust, and because of his backstory, which is full of tremendous events, like he gets shot in the head, he still survives, he murders, allegedly, his family, and he doesn't remember it. He gets chased by the police, but he doesn't know. It's a character that's really quite unique. So it's not exactly somebody that you would believe exists, and you would not also take his word 100% into account. On the other hand, as a person who tries to justify his actions and how he tries to do it, like by saying to us, by explaining to us how he got into this story and how the situation was and how he, in every situation he justifies why he acted like he did. So in general, he's very implausible, but in the actions that he does in this specific moment that he acts, it is very plausible what he does. He couldn't do anything else. So from this perspective, I would say that, historical characters exist in historical novels anyway, and it's a very reasonable literary device in order to tell a story. But on the other hand, in the cases of modernist events like the Holocaust, they acquire other characteristics because they also, maybe it's the only way to try to approach these things in 1,000 pages. How much more should you write? Although maybe in other more simple events, to say, simply because we have the time distance to simplify them in our minds, maybe there are many other ways to have a character and explain this. And then first for Ethan, the thing, how he got into the Nazi party is not his choice. I think this is important. He was facing a criminal, because he was found that he had a homosexual, so he was with another homosexual in Theodor Park, and he was found. And he was lucky because there was a friend of him in the police, and he told me, either I will prosecute you, or you are going to the Nazi party. So he's covered from the side. He didn't want to be part. Maybe he would later, but he explains to us why he did it. And of course, it is the question in the whole book who is to judge. And exactly if we take him into 100% into account and we believe everything he says, we would say, okay, he is right, we cannot judge what he did. Yeah, okay, the guy did nothing wrong. But of course, there is a morality in the way we're thinking about everything. And this historicization of everything leads us very easily to say, well, they did what they had to do, and there is nothing else. But also, on the other hand, we always have in our mind that there are always alternatives, and there is not only this one side that somebody tells us, but there is something else that could be done. Maybe we can even not think about it, but somehow we believe, and I think, that there are always alternatives. And this is about White, if it is instantiation. No, it is not. The White's examples are much more complicated, I think. He takes a wolf, for example, and explains why this scene resembles the way the historical... Well, the Littell does nothing like this. His text is, in many senses, pretty easy and traditional. It is linear when it's not the phases where Maximiliano loses his mind, he thinks whatever, or when he is not in delirium. It's easy to follow, and it is ideally a result, exactly like you said, and that's what I also conclude in the book, that it is a result of all this thinking about how we can approach historical writings. It is not that Littell has read White, maybe he has, I don't know, but it's not a result because he has read it, but because there is this discussion, this ongoing discussion that's also reflected in historical books. And as Littell read all these books in the same way that he felt directly the need to say, okay, if I write about this, historians are going to come and tell, no, that's not correct, you should do it like this. And I will try my best to cite them, to say the numbers as they are in this book, to participate in the debates, to do everything to do that will make my opinion sound kind of academic to be accepted. In the same way, but indirectly, we also see his text a reflection of all these discussions that are going on. And I think that if you read 100 books about the Holocaust, you will take this, you will understand that there is something going on in these books. There is a discussion, theoretical discussion underneath all these narratives. And we can see, so I saw it, I don't know if you saw it, but I saw it in the book. I saw that Deile really tried to be a historian and at the same time to give a theoretical, his theoretical opinion about how events like the perpetrator perspective of the Holocaust should be narrated.
Great. Perhaps Tamika can also respond to her question.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay? I just fiddled with my microphone settings. I'm good? All right, fantastic. I'm so glad that you brought that up and asked that question. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name of the gentleman who asked the question about contemporary morals in these simulations. Anyway.
I'm Ilkka Lähteenmäki. It's a pretty non-internationally well-working name.
Thank you so much. Awesome. So I'm really glad that you brought this up because, you know, I feel like what you're really raising here is, can we feel historical emotions? Can we think like historical actors? You know, is there any way for us to really access that? And I mean, I would say no, we can't feel historical emotions. We can't, you know, think exactly like past actors did. There is a world of distance between us and them. But I think that can be integrated into part of this process. That's part of this historical thinking that we do. So you're asking, you know, if we put a contemporary person with contemporary morals into these historical sort of simulations, is there any value to that? You know, can we think like them? And, you know, we can't get exactly there, but no work of history can exactly capture the past as it really was. There is always that recognition that, you know, as our contemporary selves, we can't 100% access that. We can never 100% get there, but we still try. You know, we have to try. Well, otherwise, what is the purpose of our discipline? You know, why do we do history? So, and I really think that these works can frame their simulations, and they can frame the player's role in a way that evokes as much empathy as we can realistically achieve, while also emphasizing the distance between the contemporary self and the historical other. And, you know, there is a vast literature on empathy and critical historical thinking that I engage with a lot in my work. And most of the consensus in this field is that you need empathy and you need distance. Alison's book, Engaging the Past, is the best place to start. I'd highly recommend checking that out. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. It's not possible, but we have to try, I think, is how I would sum it up.
We'll take some more questions. We have 15 minutes left. I see we have 2 questions, 3 in the room, but also 2 online. I suggest we take the questions online first. So, Fernando, I think you were first.
Thank you. I would like to congratulate all the panelists for the excellent presentations. And I have a question for the 3. If you would like to answer. Till yesterday, we were discussing the limits of representation of Holocaust, the ethical limits of representation, the aesthetic limits of representation. And now we're talking about these cool stuff like games and holograms. And I would like to ask the 3 of you if the question of limits of representations is still working, or this is a past phase of Holocaust studies. No, there's no more preoccupations about these limits whatsoever. They could be, and everything's permitted now in the quest for meaning. And I have another question, brief question to Tamika and Lars. Yes, to Lars. If we are in a post-representationalist scene of historical studies now, in which we can the Holocaust studies, we can transpose the barrier of we were not there. We were not in the games. If the games and if the holograms can transpose this barrier that the traditional forms of understanding the Holocaust puts us. Thank you.
We can take another question quickly.
Yes, thank you. So thank you for these fascinating presentations. And my question is to Lars. First of all, just to say quickly that that's a great way to catch the attention of your audience by calling the subject of your talk a nonsense at the beginning of the presentation. I was thinking about audience research. Frankly, your presentation made me think about that. Has there been any audience research done on how people coming from various age groups, for example, various backgrounds react and make sense of the holograms? And it made me wonder, you know, this point that is bad history, is it even supposed to be history? Is that the purpose? Is that the intent? Is that what we want from it to be good history? It made me think also of Ilka's presentation from the other day about transmedia history and how his point how when we encounter a certain kind of representation of the past that makes us search for more information on that particular subject elsewhere, and maybe that could be, you know, one purpose of these holograms, that they're just, that's the sole function, to trigger in us curiosity, interest, wanting to know more. And I wonder if these holograms could also work better if we do give the authorship, this more authorial agency to the people who give the testimonies, and we kind of give up this idea, you know, we just accept that, you know, it's finite. These people will die soon, and, you know, let's just give them the decision and authority over what they want to leave behind and what they want to say, and have that kind of resource instead of creating this opportunity that, you know, you can ask anything and from this hologram person. Thank you.
Thanks. I suggest we take the questions from the room as well, Wolf, and then you will all have 3 minutes to answer.
And that's right, maybe a little bit more of a comment. I want to start with the figure of the survivor, because I think the papers present also the fantastic layering of different figures. The first we have, of course, looming there, the actual dialogue, the dialogue between survivors and people. That's the first one. So these figures of survivors are at home in different media ecologies. Yes, there's one that is culturally constructed, but is in the real world, in an analog setting. Then you have the first order simulation, which is the videotape, and then you have the second order simulation, which is the hologram we have seen. And I really like the question about audience research, because about the success of these different figures, as media figures, we don't know a lot. I think we can argue that in the analog world, it worked. There was a time when it worked, because the culturally constructed aura of contemporaneity, that is, there is a person who was there. It's culturally constructed. Of course, there are other figures that work, but it worked in the sense that it created, I think, in many settings, teaching settings, a feeling of reflexivity, or in a willingness to reflect about the events. About the video testimonies, if they work, they play on loops in so many institutions, they're accessible in many places. If they actually work in inducing a sense of reflexivity, I don't know, and I have my doubts about them. Incidentally, they do work relatively well as historical source material, despite the fact that the questioning at the time was mechanical, right? Nevertheless, because there are so many of them, they actually work for historians quite well. The best indication is Christopher Browning's work, Remembering Survival, where he used, among other sources, precisely that archive, and I think he used it very compellingly. So it didn't maybe work for the purpose of creating self-reflexive and self-critical memories so well, the video testimonies, but they did work for historians, and I think will continue to work for historians. And they do, because of the fantastic software that the foundation created. Without that software, the collection would be worthless. It is the software, and it is very good software, that creates it into a valuable resource for historians. Okay, now the next level of simulation is the hologram. And look, I mean, I think in many ways I applaud the effort. I think it's you know, it's worse than fighting windmills. But I applaud the effort of trying to capture something. If it worked, if there was a generation of students who actually had very meaningful encounters with survivors in the 1980s, 1990s, after 2000, if that was true, wouldn't it be marvelous if we can extend that experience for future generations? That's not an unethical objective, I would say. It didn't work because the whole setup is so dishonest about power, as Lars also has pointed out. It doesn't work because there are these strange limits that the producers impose upon themselves. They're not courageous enough because, as you have also shown, Lars, they insist that every word that is spoken was actually spoken by the survivor before his or her death. That's understandable, but it's a naive idea of authenticity. But at the same time, all the other parameters are manipulated at will, including, of course, the words, as you have shown. So there's a strange sense of what is authentic and what should be prepared. Now, having said all that, by the way, we should add that the technology that is involved here doesn't work, right? All these cameras have the purpose at some point in the future that hopefully there can be a figure projected into space. That technology does not exist yet. So again, we should applaud the designers that they're capturing data for a future projection that they cannot deliver yet. Because what they do now is they project it on 2 dimensions. They project it on glass. That's what they do. They use technology that existed for 150 years. So there are lots of ironies, and the ironies, I think, are so interesting. But we should use the ironies. And I think we should use the ironies for self-reflection. So I, for one, when I listen to Lars, I'm not so sure what history is. I would like to think back critically about history and positively about history by way of these at the moment failed experiments, but important experiments. And here's the final point, because when I say the producers of the holograms, they lack courage, then what I'm saying is they were not willing to do the next step. And ironically, the next step for them would have been to become historians and do the work that historians do, that is, to create plausible images that are highly composite. That's what historians do. Historians condense a vast amount of evidence into then a very condensed image of the past, figuration of the past, story of the past. So, meaning for the production, if the producers had been willing to step forward and say, we are using these testimonies, we are using these data to create, of course, a composite figure, but a composite figure that abides by our rules of evidence. For that, they would have to have the courage of going fully digital and having a figure there that could be animation, that could be all kinds of things, that could be realistic, but a figure that embodies the results of a lot of composite research. That would have been very interesting, and that, I think, could be the next step. For that, you don't need a living survivor, you need a lot of research, right? And that, of course, is then also very compatible to the discussions about Littell. Final point on that one. I think when Hayden White was talking about modernism, he was thinking about modernist historiography. He was not thinking about modernist fiction. He was thinking about the devices of modernist fiction to be applied to modernist historiography. Littell is not what Hayden was thinking about, because again, you don't want a fictitious figure in there. All the figures should be diligently researched by the rules of evidence of historians. So if in the focal point of Littell would have been an actual perpetrator, then we're talking, then we're in the business. Because that's the step I think Hayden White wanted historians to take. Radical multi-perspectivity, allowing for doubt, channeling their doubts, and insisting at the same time on what they think they know, right? Doing both of these gestures. He wasn't asking for creating a hybrid of fiction and non-fiction. He wanted complex, honest, transparent, ethically self-reflexive non-fiction, I would say.
Thank you. We have one last question. Yeah.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, I'm talking to you. You can ask your question.
First, more of a comment. Lars, you know, this technology is being developed. It becomes then cheaper later as old technology, and then it'll be used. And I think that's part of what we also have to take into account. And it's already been done in a clumsy way, but nevertheless it's being done by, among others, I don't know whether you know it, but Narendra Modi, right? So the populist Indian politician who has in 2014 notoriously rallied with holograms, right? So to reach many more people. And you can wonder whether it worked or not. It doesn't have the interactive. He just did rallies. He talked to the people in different places at once. But of course there, the technology itself is part of the marvel of how he can be a Hinduist, traditional, conservative, but state-of-the-art modern. So I think basically part of that is just attracting audience. It was a spectacle. It's just a spectacle as it's been in the past. Now he just in January still use the hologram to what he says he will use 5 holograms to make up for the mistakes that were made historiographically after the independence. That is the forgotten figures according to him, and it's of course Hindu nationalists who have to be projected. There's now in January one huge hologram being projected in the India Gate in Delhi. So I'm just saying, you know, politicians will, of course, use this technology and well. Then on the gaming, I mean, I guess I'm far less enthusiastic since many years, I think, Wolf, than you about immersion, about what these technologies do and so on. Because basically, of something that has already been said, many times been said, same with empathy. We know from literature very well that empathy can be used for very unsympathetic reasons, right? We know that a good torturer need to be very good in empathy, right? We know the same, and that's for Tamika, the dream of catching it as it really was. I mean, if anyone knew in direct forms of violence how it really was, probably even better than the victims, is the perpetrators, right? They didn't see how it was for one victim, they saw for how it was for many victims if they're mass perpetrators. The same with the guilt. Of course, audience research is of the essence. I completely agree with that. We need to know what does it really do with audiences, how does it work, and we don't know enough yet. But I would say, in the meantime, that we don't know it yet, we wouldn't, for example, even should allow ourselves to use the assumption that guilt, evoking guilt, is productive, because we also know from perpetrator studies that guilt can be used to maintain your idea of being a real human, not being morally corrupted because, yeah, I did that, but I felt guilt. You always hear that. This kind of confession, in confession studies, for example, you very often see that they stress, the perpetrators stress how they felt guilt. So I wonder whether your players are not a light version of that, right? So as long as we have these assumptions, what are we doing, you know? Yeah.
Great. We're already over time, so I suggest the speakers all get a short minute to answer. Tamika, you go ahead.
Okay, cool. This is the TikTok version of my response. So first question I think was, do the limits of representation still matter when we're looking at Holocaust representation? I would say, yes, they do still matter, but they are constantly being renegotiated. I think that, just as once we thought that film was not an appropriate way to represent, and now film is much more widely accepted, I think the same thing will eventually happen with video games and digital media. There are unique limitations, there are unique tensions and problems, as some I laid out in my presentation, but I think this is going to be a constant ongoing process of renegotiation. So yes, they still matter, but always in different ways. The next points, can digital media overcome the barrier of like, we were not there? And I think that also connects well to that last comment. I want to emphasize that I don't view video games or digital media as a way to experience what it was really like or as it really was. I view them more as a way to think historically. I don't believe that, trying to just immerse people in, this is what it was really like and what people were really feeling. And that's not the end goal to me. I think that getting to something close to that is maybe part of it, but it's not the end of the process. So, what you see in these historical problem spaces is that we're really thinking about the question, why did people act the way that they did? Or why did these things happen the way that they did? We're asking the questions of historians. And, to some extent, you need to think about, okay, what factors were influencing, this situation? But that's not the same to me as like, this is what it was really like to be there. There's important differences. And yeah, I would totally agree. Evoking guilt is not necessarily productive. I just use guilt as one example of how, there can be stakes and there can be emotions involved. I think that's a really awesome point. And I was thinking maybe a game could even call that out, if you're feeling guilt when you're, virtually enacting something like this. And, the game could even frame it in a sense where exactly what you said is highlighted, that guilt can be a way for people to, not confront, the real problem. So that's my TikTok version, my 60-second response. Thank you.
Okay, so for the first question, I would agree with Tamika. And just to add that I am afraid that the war in Ukraine, the Russian expansion and the accusations of genocide will just put more limits to the discussion and not less. That's what I'm afraid of, I don't know. And just a short comment on Wolf. Yeah, thanks for the. I started also a lot with this. Does White really mean modernist historiography, or does he mean? Well, the thing is that at first, for sure, he had in mind modern historiography. But what I got from his last text, especially in the practical past, he was so disappointed by the reactions of historians that I don't think he ever explicitly again mentioned that he only has in mind modern historiography. I think he left the door open for this, and even if he didn't, which we should go to the text and see, but I think that he did, then I would like to open it. So I think we should open it. Yeah.
Great.
I have 50 minutes, 50 seconds. Audience research, very important thing there. Must have been done some things, especially by the organizations who put these things into existence. Also probably by the politicians behind the India example. They must try to get to know if it works and why it works and not and so on. But there is not so much published on that, especially on the hologram testimony. And it would also be interesting to do research on those people who did these things. We know about Eva Schloss, about others who were already video recorded and did the hologram thing again, that they really hoped that their voice will not end after their death. They have a point to make, and I fully understand that they have a point to make, and that they want to get over their own death by that. That's why they were already willing to be video filmed, and they were willing to do this enormous filming of the three-dimensional filming. Authorship is very important. I mean, the software of the Visual History Archive is excellent because you can do research on it. You can search for certain words or topics or phrases. You can search the whole library, and that's the excellent thing. The hologram would have been better, I guess, if it would only work like a search machine and not like a recorded and curated narration. I think maybe the future is not in these hologram things, but in gaming. Because the question is, do we want to learn by these things about the Holocaust? Do we want to get to know about the Holocaust? Or are the pedagogical instances of being a good person and not a bad one, of not becoming a perpetrator, of doing the right decisions if you have come to decisions like this? This is behind this, and maybe it somehow distances from the actual experience or the connection to the event itself. Nobody wants to hear this really, but I think it happens.
Great. Thank you to all speakers, and I think this was a great panel. It's always a good thing when we don't have enough time, so I look forward to further discussions.